Hello, everyone. My name is Harmon Colvette, and today we will be going over the first slideshow in our series on teaching the basics of neuroscience to high school students and hopefully other grades of students. This first slideshow is what is a neuron and what is neural circuit pathway. And today we're just going to discuss what the best practices are for teaching it because I had the opportunity to teach this to different high school students, and there are some good tips and tricks to go through the slides. So we'll get into it. The first thing you can do with your students is this very simple activity. One thing is if students have a background in electricity or basic cells and neuroscience, you can skim through those parts a lot more quickly. But if they have no experience in wiring or circuitry or anything like this is a very good way to start. If you can, the students can go to this link, fed.colorado. It's an amazing website that helps draw circuits, and you can kind of work together as a whole class as one. You can show them the example on the board. But my favorite thing to ask is always, if you were to go to Lowe's and if you were going to make a shopping list of everything you needed, what would you need? And that we can see here in this hint is a battery, a wire, resistor, and a light bulb. And then you can add switch too if you'd like. That's the kind of the next step. But that's a good way to start. What would you need if you were going to go to Lowe's and make this yourself? So once you make that list, then you can see the solution at the end of the slideshow, and we can skip that later. But the big thing is the order of operations. So you have that battery, then you can give a switch if you want the switch, and then that goes through all the wires as we put in between them all, and then through the resistor into the light bulb. The big takeaway we want for this is to understand that you have inputs and then outputs, and the input in this scenario is the battery, putting that battery into it, and especially flicking the switch. But that is the first step. And if the students have a background in electrical circuitry, then it should be very easy to go through this. And if not, you can take a lot more time and really go through the simple circuit. And then you can kind of move on further with how it works in a room, or then you can move on with 1C, a neural pathway. In my experience, if this is the first time students are going through electrical circuits, you can not do 1C because then you can just explain it thoroughly throughout the lesson, and then you can double back to it. That's a lot easier. And then here are your solutions. All right, now we get into the content of the lecture. The first thing is a neuron. The neuron is the building block. Like I would always like to mention students that you have Legos. The Lego house has the nervous system. The Legos are neurons. Neurons send and receive all of our signals. They run everything, anything you can think of. You ask students to list off things, and anything that your brain can do, neurons do. Understanding what you see, feeling things, moving muscles, that is all neurons. And that's really what you need to really drive in with these students, is that neurons control everything we do. And you can kind of make that first statement that neurons are the same thing as electrical systems, and our nervous system, it's an electrical system in itself. So this is where you can start making those parallels between the two. Then we get into the parts of a neuron. The big three parts that I found are the most important for students are the dendrite, the dendrites, the soma, and the axon. So if we can really push in the dendrite, the soma, and the axon. So the dendrite receives inputs, and I like to say it's about 20,000 inputs at times. That's kind of like receiving 20,000 text messages in a certain amount of time, having to just take all that information in. And the soma's job is to take all those inputs and create one output. And then once it's done with that, it's sent through the axon, and the axon sends it to the next place. But the big thing is just dendrites receive, somas condense that information, and axon send it on. And then the question is then, what is that language that we use? What are those language the cells use? And you can kind of communicate to the students that these action potentials are what the cells use to create signals, to communicate, to speak with one another. And the myelin sheath is interesting because you can have diseases that are caused from demyelination of the axon, but that's a little more than we're talking about today. Many of your synapses, the big thing is just understanding that neurons talk to other neurons. And then this is kind of the next section. So once the students are very confident on neurons, if they've talked about neurons before, it's much easier, but you really need to hone in that neuron concept, the concept of the dendrite, and axon. Once those have been dialed in, then you can move on to this section, which is the brain having the circuits and pathways. Once they understand the neurons, they can understand that these neurons come together to form circuitry, kind of similar to how we drew with the light system. Out of these two pictures on the right, there's a lot of different parts of the brain. You can mention how scientists have been figuring out different parts of the brain, what they all do, and how it is a very fascinating field. But the big example is the amygdala. That's what this point 2 is here. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. And as we go through the next slides, we're going to talk about fear and how we learn fear. So that's why the best example to give is the amygdala, because it will come up later. And then this next slide, this is kind of open to you. So the concept of hertz, cycles per second, action potentials per second, is very important. We want students to really understand that if you have 13 action potentials in 1 second, that's a firing rate of 13 hertz. Or if you have 10 hertz and you do it for 3 seconds, how many action potentials do you expect? 30. We really want to push that concept of what a hertz is. If a hertz is cycles per second, how can we convert from number of firings to hertz? So that's what these are for. We have a different ideas, and depending on what you've covered in your class, if you have opportunity to get a pendulum and you can actually count the number of times it swings back and forth, that'd be very good. Sound waves, if you've talked about radio waves, that'd be excellent. Electrical devices, again, if you've talked about these things, it's very good. You can cover them. Some very simple ones. So number 4, heart rate. If you have a heart rate of 120 beats per minute, and how would you convert that to seconds, right? You divide it by 60 because there's 60 seconds in a minute, so then it gets 2 beats per second. Well, you can say that's 2 hertz. All these unit conversions between like cycles per minute, cycles per second, total cycles, total number of seconds, that's our big drive here, is being able to convert between all of that. Because as we'll see in some of our future lessons and our future collabs, the ability to count hertz and be able to just do that math is very, very, very important. Another opportunity you can do is you can have one student stand in the front of the class, and that student will start clapping, and you can time it for 30 seconds. They can clap, or 15, or a minute, however long you want to do. And then the students can convert. Okay, if he clapped 30 times in 15 seconds, well, you can do 30 times 15 seconds, you divide it, and that'd be 2 times per second. And then you say it's 2 hertz. And then you could say, oh, if he kept doing it at 2 hertz for a minute, how many claps would that be? And you do, well, 2 times 60 is 120. There you go, 120 beats. But again, that's very important to get this concept down of hertz. And here's this slide that talks about firing rates. And this graph down here at the bottom middle of the black spikes, the best thing you can do is, as an example, count the spikes. So what you can do is say, okay, if this happens over 1 second, let's say this graph is 1 second, what's the firing rate in hertz? You say, well, 12 firings divided by 1 second, 12 hertz. There you go. Or you can then say, well, let's say it happens over 3 seconds. Well, then it would be 12 action potentials divided by 3 seconds, which is 4 hertz. And again, there you cannot do too many examples with this. You really want to make sure every student understands. You take the number of spikes, divide it by the number of seconds, and there you get your hertz. And then if you want to go to the number of spikes, you do the firing rate times the number of seconds. And just that formula is very important. Next, this is kind of the point where we start putting everything back together. So going back to like the brain, we can zoom out more. We have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is everything else. The main story of this is the nervous system has 2 sets of one-way streets. What do I mean by that? If you touch an object, right, your finger feels it. It goes up to your brain. And let's say it's hot. Your brain says, oh, let's move that hand. So it goes back down to the hand and it moves it. That's the concept we're trying to talk about here when we say two sets of one-way streets. And it comes in handy when we talk about things like fear or salivation and other things like that. This last slide is a good example. It doesn't have to be studied too hard. It's not going to come up any later. It's just an example of how circuits are used. One thing that is interesting is how the brain flips it, how the left visual field ends up on the right side of the brain, and just something interesting for students to know. Then now we want to sketch a neuron. The big things we're shooting for when they sketch a neuron are the soma, the dendrite, and the axon. Specifically, you want to have those dendrites. It doesn't have to be very pretty. Just if they can just put up, honestly, just some circular figure and just label it dendrite, and then a soma connected to it, and then an axon that comes off the end, one snaking axon that comes off, and they're able to kind of understand that dendrite receives, the soma comprehends, condenses all those inputs into one output, and it sends it down to axon. If they can kind of get that concept, that's exactly what we're really shooting for when sketching a neuron. The axon hillock, the myelin sheath, those are important, good to have, but not absolutely necessary. The big thing is, and this is what I would like to do, or what I like to do when I was teaching this, I just have them draw the dendrite, soma, and axon. Those three things, and the order, kind of how they are biologically mattered. So the dendrite connects to the soma, which connects to the axon. And then I would say draw an arrow to show the way information flows. And the big thing is they should draw that arrow from the dendrite to the axon, and that's kind of the last, like, they get it type measure. And then now we sketch a neural pathway. This is very simple. This is kind of like how we drew our electrical pathways. If we hear a tone, such as music, let's say, what is the path that signal takes? So it starts with the tone playing, our ear hears it, then it goes through the cochlear nerves, and it goes up through the brain, and it's processed inside the brain. And that's really all we're looking for. It's just where does it go? Where is the end place? And that's the brain. And then lastly, the goal is students should be able to describe all these terms. If given a blank quiz with just the terms, they should be able to explain them. CNS stands for central nervous system. And then if they can understand these terms and then understand the concepts of the fear circuitry, or just circuitry in general, they'll be very well off for the next lesson where we actually talk about applying these circuits to things like the fear circuit.